My name is Barbara Kellerman. My title is the James McGregor Burns Lecturer in Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. I've been there for over a decade and a half. I've also been an academic entrepreneur. I was the founding executive director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. But my main claim to fame, such as it is as a student of leadership and followership, what I now call the leadership system.
And how did you come to that? What's your background?
Well, I'm a political scientist by training, and when I I have a PhD from Yale. When I first started teaching, I knew I wanted to do leadership in one or another guise. Even my dissertation had the word leader or leadership in it. But when I wanted to get a job, I found there was not exactly a huge market for leadership. So I became a sort of specialist in the American presidency. But as soon as I had a toehold in academia, I really migrated to leadership more generally, which is where I've stayed ever since.
Okay. And talk to me a little bit about what you're doing now in your academic career.
Well, I think I see myself certainly as a teacher, obviously, but very much as a writer. I have written many books on leadership and followership and context and bad leadership, and you name it, it's got the word leadership in it or followership in at least one case. And I'm probably doing another book on leadership, which I won't talk about now, but my most recent one came out less than a year ago. And that's what I do. I'm a regular blogger and writer of articles of various kinds. So I keep saying this is my last whatever on leadership, and I keep on doing it because it's so, yeah, famous last words, exactly. And it's just, as we sit here today, as I'm sitting here today, the Pope is visiting the United States, and for anyone who has the slightest interest in leadership and followership, that's grist for our mill. In fact, I'll probably open with some comments about that particular visit because it's fairly striking in many ways, not just in terms of leadership, but followership as well.
Okay, so you've intrigued me. Tell me a little bit about why it's such a model.
Why the Pope's visit is such a, did you say a model?
I did.
I'm not sure I'd use the word model because I think it's sui generis. I think that's one of the striking things about it. It's, it's not as if I have a particular vested interest in this figure, but it's impossible to have watched him and, again, more particularly, watched people's responses to him without being interested. It's a quite unusual situation for very obvious reasons and some less obvious reasons. So how one goes through this period of several days and looks at the various players without, if you have an interest in this subject, without being drawn to it, seems to me impossible.
So I'm interested in your take. I know that this is a complex subject, but as a leadership expert with a depth of experience, what are you seeing as you watch this
in the visit of the Pope?
Yes.
Well, as I suggested a moment ago, I am actually, from my perspective, interested in the systemic aspects. He's obviously center stage, but someone with my proclivity who thinks in terms of systems and not just in terms of individuals, that's really where I come from now. I'm equally interested, and I think equally important to the Pope himself are the large cast of characters, whether those are Catholics, whether those are politicians, whether they're non-believers, atheists, young, old, children, adults, all the different players. He's obviously at the United Nations on this particular morning. But that's not all he's doing in New York. He's being very careful to speak to several different audiences, so that consciousness of how you reach out to various constituencies interests me, and also the context within which he's doing it. Again, given that I have a systemic approach, I don't think you can look at this without being aware of the particular context, the moment in time, the fact that he's in the United States, he's been in D.C., the way the world is at this moment. So to get the whole thing, you really need to look at the man himself, all those who are not everybody's interested, obviously, but very many people are. He seems to be having an effect on people, so all those other characters as well, and the context within which both leaders and followers are situated.
Very interesting. If I am a coach and a member of our association, and I go on our website and look at your material, what am I going to see? What's the first impression you want me to have?
Well, I can't answer what's on your website. I have no idea what's on your website or what you choose to put on your website with regard to me.
Well, but I'm asking, what would you like someone to be able to see? A coach who has never met you before, who perhaps has heard you wrote a book but didn't read it. What would you like them to know?
Yeah. Well, I have become newly interested in teaching leading, or in coaching, or in, that's not in my vocabulary, but I am interested in how so many, what I call the leadership industry, which is about 30, 40 years old, which is a huge money-making machine now. And anybody who has read one of my it's not my most recent book, it's the book before my most recent book, it's called The End of Leadership, will know that I take somewhat a jaundiced view of the leadership industry. I'm a little bit skeptical about many of the claims that it makes. So I personally tell my students, and I don't know how this translates into coaching, other people can tell me better than me, that I don't teach them how to. I'm not in the business of teaching how to lead. I am in the business of teaching about leadership. So for somebody who has an intellectual or theoretical curiosity about the practical implications of what they do, that's the business that I'm in. I absolutely believe there's a connection between intellectually understanding the different dynamics, the systemic approach, and how one would coach and how one would teach how to lead. But that remains for me to tease out, because I'm not a lot of people think like me. Most people focus on the individual. As far as I'm concerned, my work would translate into taking a somewhat broader approach. So if I were coaching somebody or teaching somebody how to lead, I would spend some time on the individual, but I would spend, as my comments have suggested, equal time on the other two elements, the other key elements. One is contextual and the other are the followers or all those others with whom the individual, who is my primary coaching target, would be interacting, and of whom he or she would need to be aware.
So your presentation today is about leadership as a system?
Correct.
I think is your title.
It is, and it's again an argument for moving away from the individual. And again, it's not to exclude the individual, it's to make the individual less exclusively the focus of coaching or teaching how to lead.
And broadening the view screen on the whole situation.
Yes, it's not about excluding. It's not about saying leaders don't matter. It is about making it a more holistic approach than simply focusing on one individual, because that's not, in my view, or in my research, how leadership actually or individual agency is exercised. I'll say one other thing. I came to this broader view when I wrote a book. This book is now about 10 years old. It's called Bad Leadership. And I'm very interested in the dark side. Again, I deviate from most of my colleagues who teach people how to be good leaders. I'm as interested in leadership failures and leadership disasters and ineffective leadership and evil leadership, how that comes to pass. So when I wrote the book Bad Leadership, I realized you could not understand bad leadership without understanding, to say the obvious, bad followership. There is no such thing as leading badly alone. You do it in tandem with other people. So how that dynamic played out, and that's where I also came to the notion of context. So should I keep on talking?
Well, yeah. What comes
Well, let me then I'll finish
your
this train of
sentence
thought.
and-
I didn't know
Yeah,
about.
no, it's fine.
Okay. To take the extreme example is the example of Hitler and Hitler's Germany. So again, one way of looking at it would be to look at what happened in Germany in the 1930s and 40s through the lens of Hitler. And there are many great and wonderful and important biographies of Hitler. But if you look at it closely, you realize that Hitler depended on a whole host of others in order to get these various deeds done without going into detail here. And you also need to look at the history of Germany in the early 1930s to understand the historical context within the Nazi regime was embedded. So that broader view really is one, as I said, the book Bad Leadership is about 10 years old. In it, I wrote about leaders, followers, and context, but it took me about a decade to codify or reify my own system. So now I talk, as I said a moment ago, in systemic terms and not in terms of individuals.
Well, you responded to the question that was in my mind, which was, could you give us a couple of examples? That's a clear one. Is there another one that comes to
Well,
mind?
I spoke about the Pope. So I think I've given, let me put it this, the better way of framing the question in my view is there is no example to which the systemic approach is not relevant. There is no such thing, again, this is me speaking, you're getting me, and I have really concluded after being in this business for several decades that to look at the leader without looking at the others with whom the leader interacts and without looking at the contexts, plural, within which the leader is embedded. And if I were coaching somebody in a particular, let's say, hospital for the sake of this conversation, I would have the person look at the hospital. Let's look at your unit, like if it's a surgeon or somebody in surgery. You look at surgery, then you look at surgery within the hospital, then you look at the hospital within modern medicine, then you look at modern medicine within the American political system and socioeconomic system more generally. That layered, I don't think this is rocket science. I do think it is a slightly more complicated approach than the typical obsession, and that's what I call it, obsession with leadership would suggest.
Which is, as you rightly point out, very focused on the individual.
Exactly, yeah. Yes.
What would be some of the key takeaways from your presentation today?
Well, it's like saying, how do you teach individual people how to lead? I don't have any idea how many people will be listening to me, whether it's 10 or 110. Or 510, I really don't know, but it will lie in the eye of the beholder. It is not, I will simply say, it is not an argument I make where people go, gee, I don't know what she's talking about. Generally, when I talk in systemic terms, people go, yeah, that makes a certain amount of sense. You can't be a CEO now. You can't be president of the United States now without having some level of awareness of the various constituencies whom you need to take into account as you're trying to create change or maintain stasis, as the case may be. So it's actually, once I make the sales pitch, taking a systemic approach rather than fixating on the individual, people generally get it. I don't feel that there's a lot of resistance to what I'm saying. In particular, just one more sentence,
Sure.
In particular because the world has changed so much. Just in the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, the technology has changed, the culture has changed, relations between leaders and followers or leaders and others have changed. So people get it. This is not some elusive argument. It seems to me a rather commonsensical one, but one that the leadership industry generally does not absorb because of the attention to the individual.